say Constable Kershaw has victimised you in the past.
I don't know what else you'd call it.
Call what?
I was once questioned by Kershaw for 3 hours because of this. It's an ordinary comb used by black people for their hair. Kershaw arrested me for possessing an offensive weapon. This.
Were you convicted of this charge?
No.
Were you even charged?
No, not even Kershaw and his cronies could make that stick.
I see, so you were not arrested. This 3-hour questioning, were there any witnesses?
Sure, about half a dozen.
Well, with so many witnesses, you could have lodged a complaint with police authorities.
Oh, I could have done, but I don't think it would have done any good.
Why not?
They were all other policemen.
I see. Once again, we have only your word.
Aren't you gallant?
No, Miss Brown. Just suspicious when anyone flings around the word victimisation.
Well, it's the right word in Kershaw's case.
Well, on the same basis, I could suggest that you are in turn victimising the officer.
I'm telling the truth, damn you!
You will not use that kind of language in this courtroom.
Miss Brown, all we require is someone to substantiate your allegations against Kershaw. Now, you see, you have admitted to a dislike of him. You have, therefore, an interest in blackening his name.
And his face. If he were one of us, he might act differently.
Why do you think this officer victimises you, Miss Brown? I mean, what have you ever done to merit such treatment?
I was born unwhite.
Oh, come on.
You know nothing about it.
There are something like 25,000 non-white residents in Fulchester. Now, are you telling this court that the officer victimises all of them on account of their colour? All 25,000?
Only if you're young, intelligent, and if you don't like being treated either as children or imbeciles.
Do you share the views expressed by Dempsey in Black March magazine?
Yes.
About waging war with the white race?
Yes.
To get out in the streets and rob in order to get money for this cause?
He didn't write that.
Do you agree with the sentiments in this article?
Whether I do or not has no bearing on the fact that I was with John during the time you're trying to say he mugged the old man.
Well, the accuracy of that remark depends very heavily on how sympathetic you are to the defendant.
In other words, I'm a liar. Reprimand him, my lord.
He is entitled to suggest that.
Dear, you seem such a nice old gentleman.
Have any further questions, Mr. Elliot?
None, my lord. Thank you, Miss Brown.
You may stand down, Miss Brown.
I call Colin Langham.
What is your religion?
C of A.
Take the testament in your right hand and read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give in this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Colin Langham of flat 16, Renshaw Buildings, Fulchester.
Please answer counsel, don't just nod your head.
Yeah.
Yes, what is your occupation?
I work in a laundry.
How old are you?
18.
See, and when did you leave school?
When I was about 15.
Now, you live with your parents.
Yeah.
Colin, did you attack and rob Mr. Simmons on the evening of November the 4th last?
No.
Where were you that evening?
At the club.
Mm-hmm. And what time did you go there?
About 8.
And did you leave the club for any length of time?
No.
You were there all the time?
Yeah, that's right.
I see. Now, what were you doing during the time you were at the club?
Played table tennis and watched the telly.
Yes. Were you with anyone in particular?
No.
Yes, but when you watched the television, you were not alone.
Oh, no. There were lots of people around.
I see. Now, coming to the moment when you lined up for Constable Kershaw.
Yeah?
Now, you didn't object to doing as he demanded.
Anything for an easy life.
Now, we've heard that Mr. Simmons picked you out.
Kershaw told him to.
How do you mean?
He called me a right little villain and said it had to be me.
You heard Constable Kershaw say this?
Everyone did.
I see. Did you ask any of your friends to back up your story about being in the club the whole evening?
Sure.
And what was the result of that?
I still got nicked.
Colin, do you know John Dempsey well?
I know him.
Well?
No. I mean, we don't have anything in common, do we? I'm no college boy.
No. Do you belong to any black militant organization?
No.
Have you ever belonged to one?
Never.
Thank you, Mr. Langham.
Mr. Langham, you were in the club all evening?
Yeah.
But with no one in particular?
Yeah, that's right.
So there's no one who can say that you didn't leave the club for, say, 10 minutes?
No.
Now, it takes less than 2 minutes to run from the club to the place where Mr. Simmons was attacked, less than 2 minutes to run back again. Now, you could have robbed Mr. Simmons and been back within 5 minutes.
I never did, though.
Didn't you? Thank you, Mr. Langham.
That concludes the case. The defence, Moore.
You will return to the dock, Mr. Lang. Mr. Elliot.
If it please my lord, members of the jury, let me simply, in summing up, say this. If you believe the defendants in this case, if you believe that during the line-up, Constable Kershaw kept up a running commentary of suggestions and innuendos directed at the two eyewitnesses, then you have no option but to believe also that Mr. Simmons and Mrs. Palmer are both guilty of perjury. But both of them have denied that the officer spoke during the identifications. Now, why should these elderly citizens lie? Now, is it not painfully obvious that the defence have called no witnesses from the Kingston Beach Youth Club because none could be found to substantiate these wild allegations? Now, without boring you with Dempsey's article again, let me select one sentence. We need money for the cause. Go out into the streets and get it. Members of the jury, is this not precisely what the accused were doing last November the 4th? Now, it's our view that based on the evidence presented before you, based on the positive identification of the defendants by two individuals, you must convict Dempsey and Langham of the offence with which they're charged. Thank you, my lord.
May it please your lordship, members of the jury. John Dempsey is accused of robbery on the evidence of two people, Mr. Simmons and Mrs. Palmer, evidence that I submit is inconclusive. Mr. Simmons, by his own admission, never saw the man who held him from behind, and you will recall that he identified him only after he'd been picked out by Mrs. Palmer, and that this identification was based entirely on the scent of his hair oil, a hair oil that was being used by virtually every other male in the club at the time. In other words, Mr. Simmons did not identify him. So let us turn to Mrs. Palmer. Now, bear in mind that she never actually saw the robbery take place. Her first glimpse of the action came when she was almost knocked head over heels by two men running out of an alley. However, she maintains that she was able to study their faces closely whilst holding them at bay with her umbrella. Mind you, she also said that they were off round the corner in half a tick. But overlooking that contradiction, do you really see this little lady holding up two big men for even 5 seconds? Do you believe that she saw them long enough to identify them positively later on? Secondly, though I'm not saying that she's a bigoted woman, she was feeling resentful that evening. Some black children had been throwing fireworks about near her flat, and on her way to find a policeman, she came across an old friend who'd been robbed by some black men. So by the time she got to the youth club, she was seething with indignation against immigrants in general and hardly able to make an impartial or even an accurate judgment. For these two reasons, then, her evidence is suspect. As to the methods used by the policeman conducting this inquiry, you've heard the defendants and the witness, Mrs. Brown, describe how he prompted Mr. Palmer, Mrs. Palmer and Mr. Simmons to pick out the two accused. And whilst we sympathise with Constable Kershaw in his difficult task and appreciate the sincerity of his motives, you heard him admit that the parade was not in accordance with police regulations, and that in the course of his duties he's often felt it right to use unorthodox methods in order to secure a conviction. Members of the jury, John Dempsey has no police record of any kind. His only error in the eyes of the police is that he once wrote an article in a college magazine supporting concerted action by coloured people in this country. Members of the jury, what student does not talk in such terms these days? It is absurd to infer from the romantic generalisations in that article that John Dempsey was planning to go out with a young boy he scarcely knew and rob Arthur Simmons of a paltry £2. In view of the inadequacy of the evidence against him, I submit that you are bound to accept the alibi given by Miss Brown and bring in a verdict of not guilty.
Mr. Sisson.
May it please your lordship. Members of the jury, many of the points concerning Mr. Dempsey made by Mr. Fry apply equally to my client, Mr. Langham. He was supposedly identified by Mr. Simmons, while Simmons was held in a grip known as a full Nelson. As has been demonstrated in this court, anyone held in such a grip, particularly by an assailant taller than he is unable to look straight in front of him. And yet, Mr. Simmons claims he looks directly at Langham as Langham stood in front of him rifling his pockets. Langham claims to have been at the youth club the entire evening. The prosecution says that during an absence of 5 minutes, he would have been able to leave the club, attack and rob Mr. Simmons, and then return. Members of the jury, You have seen my client, Colin Langham. Do you really believe that he could attack and rob an elderly man? I would remind you also of the cogent arguments put by my friend in regard to Mrs. Palmer's identification of Dempsey. In Langham's case, she corroborated Simmons' choice. But how could she do that? From seeing them during a scuffle that took place when they ran into her, a scuffle that took a few confused seconds. Furthermore, does this not seem a most unlikely partnership? My client himself has made the point that he has little in common with John Dempsey. I can only repeat what Mr. Fry has said. There is no evidence which ties in either of these men with the crime that was committed. And therefore, you must bring in a verdict of not guilty for Colin Langham.
Now, members of the jury, you will shortly retire to consider the evidence and to decide whether the two men before the court, Colin Langham and John Dempsey, did or did not attack and rob Mr. Simmons. Now, the defence do not dispute that the crime took place. There's only therefore one issue to debate. Were the authors of the crime Langham and Dempsey, or were they picked out in mistake for two other people? Or was only one of them involved, and not the other? Now, the prosecution have provided two witnesses who both say that they saw and identified Langham and Dempsey. One of them was the victim of the attack, and the other someone who saw the two attackers as they fled from the scene of the crime. Now, if you believe them, then you have no alternative but to bring in a verdict of guilty on both men. But if you believe that they had a good opportunity to see one of the defendants, not the other, then you must decide accordingly. If, however, you believe that their powers of observation were impaired sufficiently to make any identification doubtful, then again the defendants should be allowed the benefit of that doubt. Now, you may feel that there was more going on during the time of the identity parade than has here been stated. If there is any suspicion in your mind that these two men were picked out in irregular circumstances, then again you must give them the benefit of the doubt. But if the constable involved in these proceedings, Constable Kershaw, performed his duties as he said in court, then the identifications were made in accordance with the law's demand. Now remember that the prosecution must prove its case beyond all reasonable doubt. So if you have any doubt as to the guilt of these two men, then you must bring in a verdict of not guilty. I will now ask you to retire and consider your verdict.
All stand. The defendants will rise. Members of the jury, will your foreman please rise? Just answer this question, yes or no. Have you reached a verdict on both defendants, or once you are all agreed?
Yes.
In respect of John Harold Dempsey, do you find him guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
In respect of Colin Clive Langham, do you find him guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
John Harold Dempsey, Colin Clive Langham, you have both been found not guilty to the charges faced. You are free to leave the court.
Court will rise.
Next week, a chance for you to join another jury in assessing the facts when our cameras return to watch a leading case in the Crown Court.